Why America May Go to Hell. I raise these musings to invite diverse perspectives to reflect and converse on challenges of the civil rights movement in view of the present Black Lives Matter movement. First, contextual disclosure. As a professor and womanist scholar, I hold to an ethos of womanist communitarianism that womanist author Layli Phillips best describes as overlapping levels of concern for Black females' lived experiences, perspectives, and a centering lens on a commonwealth goal of positive social change to optimize well-being for all members of a community. As a clergywoman and pastor, my theological lens is gospel-centered on prophetic traditions of disciplined discernment, attentive to social pathologies and disorders of life that continue to create supremacist systems of injustice. So I disclose that my commonwealth views of societal dynamics do not often sync with status quo ideologies that urge us to drink the Kool-Aid of a post-racial society myth. I'm also a civil rights product in a Black Lives Matter world. I vividly recollect 1963 at 9 years of age watching black and white TV screen in our Philly inner city row house that was perpetually set on breaking newscasts of people who looked like my aunties and uncles and cousins in the South and like me. We watched as folks were subjected to fire hoses, attack dogs, hurled spit, and church bombing deaths of kids my age. In his 1963 I Have a Dream speech, Dr. King said, and I quote, "The whirlwinds of revolt will continue to shake the foundations of our nation until the bright day of justice emerges." By 1968, he was ready to prophetically state why America may go to hell. But in 1968, the wails and tears at the news of Dr. King's assassination were no less gut-wrenching than if one of my own family had died. And truth be told, an immediate fear set in about the reality of the dream because the leader was snatched from the living. In the aftermath of King's years, challenging issues for the movement still remain foundational to my views on what King's dream signifies for today's crisis and the Black Lives Matter movement. First, we need to be wary of risking the error to romanticize King into docile pacifist oblivion. Dr. Martin King of the earlier 1950s bus boycott years evolved by the 1968 Memphis labor boycotts into a much more astute, reality-toughened activist who often felt the weight of interlocking social ills. It's important to deconstruct oversimplifications of King's legacy by pointing out that a young 39-year-old Dr. King was increasingly aware and somewhat disheartened by what I call his reality shifts that required him to grapple with complex and multitudinous dynamics threatening the movement and against the commonweal. Thinkers like Cornel West, Michael Eric Dyson contend that King became much more radicalized, although still holding to nonviolent approaches. The late Vincent Harding, close friend and speechwriter for Dr. King, also cautioned against, and I quote, approaching King in a way that makes him easy to handle. We want King to fit our agendas. At a Boston conference in 1996, Harding further declared, and I quote, "At the same time as we listen to the new voice of King and observe him carefully, we have to recognize that this man was dealing with deep hungers, deep needs, deep weaknesses in his own life. That's the King I would like us to see, to know, not a putty-like King, but a hard, difficult, life-true King." These and other perspectives urge us to be mindful. I identify 5 reality shifts for King that compel us also to realize how deeply complex and formidable were and are the Jericho walls of America. Using a woman's communitarian lens, I move beyond King the individual to focus on what were these reality shifts and what impact to the movement then and now for the Black Lives Matter movement. A foremost reality shift was to recognize how firmly America was built on a historical ethos of exceptionalism, justified by a theological heart that undergirded a systematic construction of whiteness as God's chosen and a moral imperative of militarization as global priority of manifest destiny. And again, as Dr. White mentioned, for more research on this, I urge you to read womanist scholar and ordained Episcopalian priest, Dr. Kelly Brown Douglas's 2015 book, Stand Your Ground. The impact for King and the civil rights movement was his realization that racism wasn't just a moral bankruptcy of misguided individuals to whom an appeal to spirituality or moral framing would prevail upon them to bring about enlightened hearts. Rather, King had come to terms that Jim Crow segregation was far more embedded and interwoven into the core moral fabric and economic sustainability of the American dream. And today, to grapple race still requires grappling systemic supremacy. A second reality shift was to recognize that the rise of America as a global political economy increased this country's economic codependency on war and its political codependency on corporate structures and PAC lobby funding. The military-industrial complex, post-World War II, would divert, as former President Eisenhower warned, much-needed domestic resources to enrich a select few. By the Vietnam War, multinational corporations thrived on the supply-demand tension for materials and bodies that for King was morally